Today, I'd like to share with you the story of Thomas and Emma, two souls who loved each other completely at 22, then spent 33 years apart, carrying that love in silence. Thomas was 52 when his sister mentioned she'd run into Emma at a conference. Emma Hartford, his first love. The woman he'd let go because he thought sacrifice was noble, when really, it was the cruelest thing he could have done to both of them. And now, after decades of separate lives and separate losses, she was alone too, and asking about him. What happened when Thomas finally found the courage to dial her number is a story about love that refused to die, even after half a lifetime of waiting. I invite you to subscribe to our channel, and please, share in the comments where you're listening from today. I love knowing where our stories travel. Thomas Whitmore stood at the window of his small apartment in Seattle, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass like tears he'd learned long ago not to shed. At 52, he'd become the kind of man people described as dependable, quiet, the sort who showed up early to work and stayed late, who remembered everyone's birthday, but never celebrated his own with much fanfare. His life had taken on the comfortable predictability of a well-worn routine. Wake at 6, coffee by 6:15, at his desk at the architectural firm by 7:30, home by 6 in the evening to a dinner he'd eat alone while reading or watching whatever was on television without really seeing it. But beneath that carefully constructed exterior of contentment lived a truth Thomas had carried for 33 years. A weight so familiar it had become part of his very skeleton. He was a man who had loved once, completely and devastatingly, and had never quite figured out how to stop. Her name was Emma Catherine Morrison, though she'd be Emma Hartford now, had been for 28 years. Thomas knew this not because he'd kept obsessive track of her life. He wasn't that kind of man. But because in a city like Seattle, news traveled, especially among the circles they'd both once occupied. He knew she'd married Richard Hartford 2 years after Thomas had let her go. He knew they had 3 children, all grown now. He knew she lived in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, in one of those beautiful old houses, with gardens that probably bloomed magnificently in spring. He knew these things the way you know the geography of a place you've never visited, but have studied on maps late at night, when sleep refused to come. The rain intensified, and Thomas pressed his forehead against the cool glass, letting the chill ground him in the present moment. Tomorrow was Saturday, October 14th, and it would mark exactly 33 years since the night he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Not that anyone else would have called it a mistake. His mother had said he was being noble. His best friend had called it the most selfless thing he'd ever seen anyone do. Even Emma, through her tears, had told him she understood, that she didn't blame him, that sometimes love meant letting go. But they'd all been wrong. Love didn't mean letting go. Love meant fighting, clawing, refusing to accept defeat even when the odds were insurmountable. Love meant being selfish when everything in you wanted to be noble. Thomas had learned this too late, years too late, decades too late. By the time he'd understood that his sacrifice had been the cruelest thing he could have done to both of them, Emma had already built a life without him, had already learned to love someone else, or at least to live with someone else, in a way that looked enough like love from the outside. The memories came anyway, as they always did when he let his guard down, vivid and sharp, despite the passage of time. He was 19 again, a sophomore at the University of Washington, struggling through his architecture courses, and wondering if he'd made a mistake choosing a major that demanded so much precision, when his natural inclination was toward the artistic, the emotional, the imprecise beauty of things that couldn't be measured with rulers and protractors. He'd met Emma in the most unremarkable way possible, in the library, both reaching for the same book on Renaissance architecture. Their hands had touched, and Thomas had felt something fundamental shift in his universe, as if every moment of his life up until then had been moving him toward that exact point of contact. She'd been 18, a freshman studying art history, with auburn hair that caught the library's fluorescent lighting and transformed it into something golden, something that made Thomas think of autumn leaves and honey and every warm thing he'd ever known. They'd laughed about the coincidence of reaching for the same obscure book, had decided to share it, had ended up talking for 4 hours in a corner of the library until a tired staff member had told them it was closing time. Thomas had walked her back to her dormitory through Seattle's perpetual drizzle, and somewhere between the library and her door, he'd fallen so completely in love that he'd felt dizzy with it, disoriented by the sudden certainty that this person, this Emma Catherine Morrison with her thoughtful eyes and quick laugh, and the way she gestured with her whole body when she got excited about a topic, was the person he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. They'd been inseparable after that. The kind of couple that made other people roll their eyes or feel envious, depending on their disposition. They studied together, ate together, walked for hours through the city talking about everything and nothing. Emma had a way of seeing beauty in things Thomas had never noticed. The pattern of moss on old brick walls, the architecture of birds' nests, the particular quality of light on water at different times of day. She'd taught him to slow down, to observe, to find wonder in small things. And he'd given her something too, though he'd never been quite sure what. Maybe stability. Maybe a safe place to be exactly who she was. Maybe just the simple certainty of being completely loved. The love between them hadn't been the gentle, comfortable kind. It had been consuming, the sort of passion that made them skip classes to spend entire days in bed, talking and touching and existing in a bubble where nothing else mattered. It had been the kind of love that made Thomas understand, finally, what all those poets and songwriters had been trying to capture. That desperate need to be close to another person, to know them entirely, to be known entirely in return. Emma had been his first love, and he'd known with absolute certainty that she would be his only love, that whatever else happened in his life, this feeling, this person, would define everything that came after. They'd talked about marriage, of course, had planned it in the dreamy, impractical way of young people who believe the future is something they can control through sheer force of wanting. They'd graduate. Thomas would get his architecture license. Emma would work at a museum or gallery. They'd get a small apartment in Capitol Hill. Eventually a house with a studio where Emma could paint, and a home office where Thomas could work on designs. They'd have children someday, 2 or 3, raise them to appreciate beauty and kindness, and all the things they valued. It had all seemed so clear, so inevitable, so certain. And then, in the spring of their senior year, Thomas's father had died. A massive heart attack at 53, sudden and devastating. And in the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements and sorting through his parents' finances, Thomas had discovered the truth his father had hidden from everyone. They were drowning in debt. Medical bills from his mother's cancer treatment 3 years earlier, bills his father had shouldered alone without telling anyone, without asking for help, sacrificing everything to keep his wife alive and his family comfortable. The house had a second mortgage. There were credit cards maxed out. His mother's ongoing treatment costs were staggering. His younger sister was only 16, still in high school, still needing someone to provide for her, to make sure she could finish her education and have a future. Thomas had looked at the numbers, had felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical thing. His mother couldn't work. The cancer had left her too weak, and she needed someone to drive her to treatments, to help her with daily tasks. His sister needed stability, needed someone to be the parent their father had been. And the debt was crushing. Would take years to pay off even with a good salary. The decision had seemed clear, though it had torn him apart from the inside out. Architecture paid well, but not immediately, not for years while you worked your way up, paid your dues, built your reputation. But there was another option. Boeing was hiring, offering excellent salaries and benefits to engineers, to people with technical degrees and precision minds. Thomas had been good at the technical aspects of architecture, even if it wasn't his passion. He could do it. He could take the Boeing job, could provide for his mother and sister, could pay down the debt his father had left behind. But it would mean moving. Boeing's main facility was in Everett, 40 minutes north. And the hours would be long, demanding, consuming. It would mean giving up his dreams of architectural design, at least for the foreseeable future. It would mean postponing everything he and Emma had planned. And more than that, it would mean asking her to wait, asking her to put her own life on hold while he took care of responsibilities that weren't hers, that she'd had no part in creating. Thomas had wrestled with it for weeks, growing distant without meaning to, trying to figure out a solution that didn't exist. Emma had noticed, of course she had asked him what was wrong, had offered to help carry whatever burden he was shouldering. But how could he ask that of her? How could he ask a 22-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her to wait indefinitely while he sorted out a situation that might take years, maybe a decade, to resolve? How could he ask her to sacrifice her own dreams, her own timeline, her own future for his family's crisis? So on that October night 33 years ago, Thomas had taken Emma to their favorite spot overlooking Lake Washington. The rain had held off, and the city lights had reflected on the water like scattered diamonds. He'd held her hand, had memorized every detail of her face, and had told her he couldn't be with her anymore. Not that he didn't love her. He'd been clear about that. Had needed her to know that this wasn't about his feelings changing, but that he couldn't ask her to wait, couldn't ask her to put her life on hold for an indefinite period while he sorted out his family's situation, that she deserved someone who could give her everything, right now, not someday, not eventually, not after years of sacrifice and waiting. Emma had cried, and Thomas had cried, and they'd held each other while the Seattle rain finally began to fall, as if the sky itself was mourning what they were losing. She'd told him he was wrong, that she didn't need him to protect her from waiting, that she loved him and wanted to face whatever came together. But Thomas had been young and stupid and convinced he was doing the noble thing. He'd been so sure that letting her go was an act of love, that freeing her from the burden of his situation was the right choice. He'd been so catastrophically, devastatingly wrong. Thomas pulled away from the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. 52 years old, living alone in a modest apartment, still working at Boeing, though he'd moved up to a senior engineering position that paid well and demanded less of his time than it used to. His mother had passed away 8 years ago. His debt finally paid off 6 years before that. His sister had graduated college, gotten married, moved to Portland with her family. All the reasons he'd sacrificed everything for were gone, resolved, finished. And he was alone, had been alone for 33 years, except for a few half-hearted attempts at relationships that had never taken root, because he'd never stopped comparing every woman to Emma, never stopped finding them wanting, not because of who they were, but because of who they weren't. The phone call had come 3 days ago. His sister, calling to tell him she'd run into Emma at a conference in Portland, that they'd talked, that Emma had asked about him. And then his sister had said something that had shattered Thomas's carefully maintained equilibrium. Emma's husband had died 18 months ago. Cancer, after a long fight. Emma was alone now too, was living in Seattle still, and here his sister had paused meaningfully, was asking about him. Wanted to know how he was, if he was married, if he was happy. Thomas had ended the call in a daze, his mind racing with possibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Emma was alone. Emma had asked about him. Emma was in Seattle, in the same city where they'd met and fallen in love and torn themselves apart for what he'd thought were all the right reasons. And suddenly, after 33 years of careful avoidance, of building a life around the hole where she should have been, the possibility of seeing her again, of perhaps, and this thought made his hands shake, of perhaps trying again, loomed before him like a door he'd thought permanently closed suddenly standing ajar. His sister had given him Emma's number, had encouraged him to call, had told him that life was too short for regrets, that everyone deserved a second chance at happiness. And Thomas had been carrying that piece of paper with Emma's number on it for 3 days now, taking it out at odd moments, staring at the digits like they were a code he needed to crack, trying to find the courage to dial. Tomorrow was Saturday, October 14th, 33 years since the night he'd let her go. It felt significant somehow, like a sign from a universe he wasn't sure he believed in. And Thomas had made a decision, or rather, the decision had made itself somewhere in the sleepless hours between midnight and dawn. He would call. He would say the words he should have said 33 years ago. He would tell her that he'd never stopped loving her, that every day of those 33 years he'd carried her with him, that if there was even the smallest chance that she might feel something similar, that the love they'd shared might be something that could be rekindled, he wanted to try. It was insane. It was desperate. It was probably too late. Too much time had passed. Too much life had been lived separately. But Thomas was 52 years old, and he'd spent 33 years being careful, being noble, being selfless. And it had gotten him nothing but loneliness and regret. So tomorrow, he would be selfish. Tomorrow, he would take a chance. Tomorrow, he would finally say the words he'd been carrying for half a lifetime. The rain continued to fall on Seattle's streets, washing them clean, making everything new. And Thomas stood at his window, his heart pounding with anticipation and terror in equal measure, waiting for tomorrow to arrive. Saturday morning arrived with a clarity that felt almost aggressive after days of Seattle's typical gloom. Thomas woke before his alarm, had been awake really since 4:30, his body humming with an anxiety that felt simultaneously paralyzing and energizing. He'd rehearsed what he would say 1,000 times in his head, had written and discarded a dozen scripts, had talked himself into and out of making the call at least 40 times since the sun had risen. By 9 o'clock, he'd consumed 3 cups of coffee and paced a path into his apartment's hardwood floors. The piece of paper with Emma's number sat on his kitchen counter, the digits seeming to pulse with significance every time he looked at them. His phone lay next to it, charged and ready, mocking him with its silence and potential. Thomas picked up the paper again, studying Emma's number, as if the arrangement of digits might tell him something about the woman she'd become in the 33 years since he'd known her. His sister had said Emma looked good, that grief had marked her but not diminished her, that she still had that particular quality of presence that made people want to be near her. But what did that mean, really? How much did any of them resemble the people they'd been at 22? How much of Emma Catherine Morrison still existed inside Emma Hartford, widow, mother of 3 grown children, woman who'd lived an entire life he knew nothing about? The truth was, Thomas wasn't sure what terrified him more, that Emma might have changed completely, or that she might not have changed at all. That seeing her might resurrect feelings he'd spent decades trying to bury under the weight of responsibility and resignation, and the steady accumulation of days lived without her. He thought about the last time he'd seen her, not that night by the lake when he'd ended things, but 3 months later, unexpectedly, at a coffee shop near campus. He'd been meeting with a counselor about deferring his graduation to take the Boeing position, and she'd been there with friends, laughing at something someone had said. The sound of her laugh had stopped him in his tracks, had made his chest constrict with a pain so acute he'd wondered if this was what his father's heart attack had felt like. This sudden inability to breathe, this sense that something vital had stopped functioning. Their eyes had met across the crowded shop, and for a moment, everything else had fallen away. The months apart, the reasons they'd separated, the future that stretched before them without each other. For that one suspended moment, it had been just them, 19 and 20 again, reaching for the same book, hands touching, universe shifting. Emma's smile had faded, replaced by an expression of such naked longing that Thomas had nearly abandoned everything: his mother, his sister, his responsibilities, his noble intentions, right there in that coffee shop, nearly crossed the room and begged her to take him back. Consequences be damned. But then someone had touched Emma's arm, a young man Thomas didn't recognize, and she'd turned away, had gone back to her conversation, had chosen to let that moment pass. And Thomas had left, had gone to his meeting, had signed the papers that would lock him into a future that didn't include her. He'd heard 6 months later that she was dating Richard Hartford, a law student from a good family with excellent prospects and no crushing family debt or responsibilities that would require years of sacrifice. Thomas had told himself he was happy for her, that this was what he'd wanted, what he'd freed her to find. He'd told himself that until he almost believed it. Now, standing in his kitchen with morning sun streaming through the windows and Emma's phone number burning a hole in his consciousness, Thomas realized he'd been lying to himself for 33 years. He hadn't wanted her to find someone else. He'd wanted her to wait, to somehow intuit that he would come back for her eventually, that once he'd sorted everything out, once he'd paid the debt and secured his mother and sister's future, he would return and they would pick up where they'd left off. But life didn't work that way. People moved on. They made new lives with new people. They learned to love again, or at least to accept approximations of love that were comfortable enough to build a life around. The clock on his microwave read 9:47. A reasonable time to call. Late enough that he wouldn't be waking her, early enough that it didn't seem like he'd been agonizing over the decision all morning. Thomas picked up his phone, his hand steadier than he'd expected. He'd faced down deadlines and presentations and high-pressure situations at Boeing for 3 decades. He could make a phone call. He could dial 10 digits and wait to hear a voice he'd never forgotten, that he sometimes still heard in dreams, soft and warm and entirely Emma. He dialed before he could overthink it further, each number a small act of courage, a tiny rebellion against the careful, cautious life he'd built. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and Thomas felt his heart hammering so hard he was certain Emma would be able to hear it through the phone line. 4 rings. 5. And he began to think maybe this was the universe's way of telling him this was a mistake, that some doors were meant to stay closed, that... The ringing stopped. There was a pause, a breath, and then a voice that made Thomas's knees weak said his name, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, as if she'd been expecting his call, as if the 33 years between them had collapsed into nothing. She said his name, Thomas, and he heard everything in those 2 syllables. Recognition and surprise and something else. Something that sounded almost like relief. As if she'd been waiting too. As if she'd been carrying her own burden of what-ifs and might-have-beens through all the years of her marriage and motherhood and widowhood. Thomas found his voice, though it came out rougher than he'd intended, weighted with emotion he hadn't quite prepared for. He told her it was him, yes, as if there could be any doubt, as if his voice wasn't as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, as permanently imprinted on her memory as hers was on his. And then, because there seemed no point in pretending this was a casual call to catch up after 3 decades, because life was too short and they'd already wasted so much time, he told her the truth. He told her he'd heard about Richard, that he was sorry for her loss, that he couldn't imagine what the last 18 months had been like for her. And then, before courage could fail him, before the weight of years and propriety and all the reasons this was probably insane could stop him, he told her that he'd never stopped thinking about her, that not a day had passed in 33 years when she hadn't been somewhere in his thoughts, that he knew it was probably too late and too much and too presumptuous given everything, but that he needed her to know he'd never stopped loving her. The words tumbled out in a rush, unpolished and raw, nothing like the careful speeches he'd rehearsed. He told her about that night by the lake, about how he'd convinced himself letting her go was noble, when really it was the worst kind of cowardice, about how he'd built an entire life around the hole where she should have been. He told her about seeing her in that coffee shop, about the moment their eyes had met, and he'd almost thrown away everything to cross the room to her. He told her about the years of watching from a distance, of knowing she'd married and had children and built a life, of being genuinely glad she'd found happiness even as it killed him that it wasn't with him. And then he stopped, suddenly aware he'd been talking for several minutes without giving her a chance to respond, suddenly terrified that he'd said too much, revealed too much, made himself too vulnerable. The silence on the other end of the line stretched, and Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. She was going to tell him it was too late, that too much time had passed, that she'd moved on completely, and his confession was unwelcome and inappropriate, and Emma's voice came then, soft and broken and beautiful, telling him to stop, just stop, that she needed him to hear something. And what she said next made Thomas sit down hard on his kitchen floor, his back against the cabinets, tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt to hide them. She told him she'd never stopped loving him either, that Richard had been a good man, a kind husband, a devoted father, but that there had always been a part of her heart that belonged to Thomas, that had never quite transferred its loyalty, no matter how many years passed, or how happy she tried to be. She told him about lying awake at night during her marriage, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he ever thought about her. She told him about the coffee shop, about how seeing him had nearly broken her, how she'd gone home that day and cried for hours, mourning not just what they'd lost, but what they'd never had the chance to build. She told him about Richard's illness, about the long months of watching him fade, about feeling guilty because even in her grief, even in her devotion to caring for him, there had been moments when she'd thought about Thomas, had wondered if he was still in Seattle, still single, still the man she'd loved with such consuming passion when they were young. She told him that when his sister had mentioned his name in Portland, her heart had stopped, that she'd asked question after question, trying to piece together what his life had been like, trying to understand if the Thomas Whitmore her sister described bore any resemblance to the boy she'd loved. And then she told him something that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. She told him she'd almost called him a dozen times over the past year, had gotten his number from mutual acquaintances, had sat with her phone in her hand, finger hovering over the call button, trying to find the courage to reach across 3 decades of silence. But she'd been afraid. Afraid he'd moved on completely. Afraid he was married with his own family. Afraid that she was holding on to a memory of young love that couldn't possibly have survived the weight of time and reality. They talked for 2 hours, then 3, sprawled on their respective floors. Thomas in his kitchen, Emma, she told him, in her living room where morning sun poured through windows overlooking her garden. They talked about everything and nothing, catching up on the broad strokes of their separate lives, while simultaneously diving into the emotional truth beneath the surface facts. Emma told him about her children, Claire, 31, a doctor in San Francisco, Michael, 29, teaching high school English in Portland, Sarah, 26, just finishing her PhD in environmental science. She told him about Richard's career as a prosecutor, about the life they'd built that had been good and solid, and had given her 3 people she loved more than anything. But she also told him about the loneliness, about how you could be married and still feel fundamentally alone, about how she'd loved Richard, but had never quite experienced with him the consuming passion she'd felt with Thomas. She described it as the difference between a steady, comfortable warmth and a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. Richard had been the warmth, safe and reliable. Thomas had been the fire, and even after 33 years, the embers had never quite gone cold. Thomas told her about his mother's passing, about his sister's family, about his career at Boeing that had been successful, but had never quite felt like his true calling. He told her about the relationships he'd tried to build, the women who'd been perfectly nice and entirely wrong, the way he'd sabotaged every potential connection because none of them were her. He told her about the apartment he'd lived in for 15 years that still felt temporary, as if he'd been waiting all this time for his real life to start, for permission to want things again, to feel things again. As they talked, something shifted. The 33 years of separation beginning to feel less like an insurmountable chasm and more like a pause, an interruption in a story that had never quite ended. They fell into the old rhythm of their conversations, finishing each other's sentences, laughing at the same observations, the connection that had been forged when they were young, proving resilient enough to survive decades of neglect. Finally, as noon approached, and Thomas's kitchen floor grew uncomfortable, and the initial rush of emotion settled into something steadier, but no less profound, Emma asked him something that made his heart race with fresh anxiety. She asked if he wanted to meet, not eventually or someday, but today, now, as soon as they could manage it. She suggested the Arboretum, the Japanese garden where they'd spent countless afternoons when they were in college, talking and sketching and being young together. Thomas agreed before his brain could catalog all the reasons this might be too fast, too intense, too likely to end in disappointment when the reality of who they'd become failed to match the memory of who they'd been. They set a time, 2:00, giving them both time to prepare, to process, to work up the courage required to take this next terrifying step. After they hung up, Thomas sat on his kitchen floor for another 10 minutes, his phone clutched in his hand, trying to comprehend what had just happened. In the span of 3 hours, his entire life had shifted, possibilities opening up that he'd thought closed forever. Emma had never stopped loving him. Emma wanted to see him. Emma was willing to take a chance on seeing if what they'd had could be resurrected, rebuilt, reimagined for who they were, now rather than who they'd been. He stood finally, legs shaky, and looked at his reflection in the kitchen window. 52 years old, gray threading through the hair that had been dark when Emma knew him, lines around his eyes and mouth that mapped decades of life lived without her. He wondered what she would see when she looked at him in person, if she would find echoes of the 22-year-old boy she'd loved, or if time had transformed him into someone unrecognizable. But beneath the anxiety, beneath the fear of disappointment or awkwardness, or discovering that some doors should stay closed, Thomas felt something else stirring. Hope. Real, terrifying, exhilarating hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. That love, real love, the kind that had burned bright enough to survive 33 years of separation, might be the kind of love that deserved a second chance. He had 3 hours to shower, to find something to wear, to prepare himself to see Emma Catherine Morrison Hartford in person for the first time since that day in the coffee shop, when their eyes had met, and the world had stopped spinning. 3 hours to get ready to say in person what he'd been waiting half a lifetime to say. Thomas moved through his apartment with renewed purpose, the morning's paralysis replaced by focused energy. Whatever happened this afternoon, whatever came of this meeting, at least he would know. At least he would have tried. At least he wouldn't spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been if only he'd had the courage to reach out, to be honest, to risk his heart one more time on the only woman who'd ever truly held it. The morning sun continued to stream through his windows, warming everything it touched, and for the first time in 33 years, Thomas allowed himself to believe that warmth might extend to him, that he might be allowed to step out of the cold he'd been living in and into something that felt like coming home. The Washington Park Arboretum stretched out before Thomas, like a landscape of memory made tangible. He'd arrived 20 minutes early, unable to bear staying in his apartment a moment longer, his nervous energy demanding motion, action, forward momentum toward whatever was about to happen. October had painted the trees in shades of amber and crimson, the Japanese garden's carefully manicured paths winding through fall colors that seemed almost aggressive in their beauty, as if nature itself was determined to make this afternoon memorable. Thomas walked slowly along the familiar paths, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets to keep them from trembling. Every step felt weighted with significance, every breath an act of courage. He'd changed clothes 4 times before settling on dark jeans and a navy sweater, wanting to look put together without seeming like he'd tried too hard, walking that impossible line between casual and significant. His hair, showered and combed, had refused to cooperate entirely, still holding that slight wave Emma used to love running her fingers through. The thought of her touching him again, even in that simple way, made his stomach flip with anticipation and terror in equal measure. He found himself gravitating toward their spot, the bench near the stone lantern where they'd spent countless afternoons when they were students. The bench had been replaced at some point in the intervening decades. The wood newer, unmarked by the initials they'd once carved there in a moment of youthful certainty that their love would outlast stone and wood and time itself. But the location was the same. The view across the pond identical to his memory. And standing there, Thomas could almost see them as they'd been, young and optimistic, and so certain they had forever stretching before them. He checked his phone for the dozenth time. 1:53. 7 minutes until Emma was supposed to arrive, though she might be early like him, might already be here somewhere among the paths and bridges and carefully arranged stones, working up her own courage to face him after all these years. The thought made him scan the garden with fresh urgency, his heart rate accelerating every time he caught a glimpse of auburn hair or a feminine figure in the distance. And then he saw her. She was walking along the path that curved around the pond, moving with the same graceful certainty he remembered, though perhaps more slowly, more carefully than the girl who'd once run through these gardens pulling him along by the hand, laughing at his protests that they should slow down, take their time, not rush through beauty. Time had marked her. He could see that even from a distance, had added silver to the auburn hair she wore shorter now, had etched lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of years of smiling and worrying and living a life he knew nothing about. But she was still Emma. Still unmistakably, fundamentally, devastatingly Emma. The way she moved, the tilt of her head as she looked around the garden, the particular quality of presence that had always made her seem more vividly alive than other people. All of it exactly as he remembered, as if some essential part of her had remained untouched by time's passage. Their eyes met across the distance, and Thomas felt the same jolt of recognition he'd felt in that library 34 years ago, in that coffee shop 33 years ago. The same fundamental sense that this person was important, was essential, was somehow the missing piece that made him complete. Emma stopped walking, her hand going to her chest as if to steady a heart that must be racing as hard as his own. And for a long moment they simply stood there, separated by 50 feet of garden path and 33 years of separate lives, looking at each other like drowning people who'd just spotted land. Then Emma smiled, that particular smile that had always seemed to start in her eyes before spreading to her mouth. And Thomas felt something in his chest unlock, some tightness he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He started walking toward her, and she toward him, and the distance between them closed with a speed that felt both agonizingly slow and impossibly fast. They stopped a few feet apart, close enough to touch, but not touching, both seeming to need this moment to simply look, to confirm that the person standing before them was real and present, and not just another dream or memory or wish disguised as possibility. Thomas cataloged the changes time had wrought. The silver in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the way she carried herself with a weight that hadn't been there when she was 22. But beneath the changes, he saw her, the essential Emma he'd loved with such consuming passion, who he'd apparently never stopped loving despite 3 decades of trying. Emma spoke first, her voice carrying that same warm timbre he'd heard on the phone, though softer now, almost wondering, as if she couldn't quite believe he was standing in front of her. She said his name again, Thomas, and this time it sounded like a prayer, or a confession, or both, like something she'd been holding inside for too long and was finally allowed to release. Thomas found himself reaching for her hands before conscious thought could intervene, and Emma let him take them, her fingers curling around his with a familiarity that made his breath catch. Her hands were smaller than he remembered, or perhaps his had simply grown larger with age and work, but they fit together in the same way, her palms against his palms, her fingers interlacing with his fingers, the connection electric and grounding simultaneously. They stood like that for a long moment, holding hands and looking at each other and trying to compress 33 years of separation into one loaded silence. And then, as if some unspoken agreement had passed between them, they moved together, Emma stepping forward as Thomas pulled her close, and suddenly he was holding her, really holding her, his arms around her back and her face pressed against his chest, and her arms wrapped tight around his waist like she was afraid he might disappear if she didn't hold on hard enough. Thomas buried his face in her hair, breathing in a scent that was both familiar and new. Still Emma underneath, but layered now with different shampoo, different perfume. The accumulation of years lived in different houses, different lives. She was trembling, he realized. Or maybe he was trembling. Or maybe they both were. Their bodies remembering something their minds had tried to forget. This feeling of absolute rightness, of coming home after a long journey to a place you'd thought you'd never find again. They stood like that for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing meaning in the face of reunion. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears streaming down their faces without shame or embarrassment, the tears of people who'd carried grief so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down, to allow themselves to feel something other than the ache of loss. They moved to the bench near their old spot, sitting close enough that their thighs pressed together, their hands still linked, neither willing to break physical contact now that they'd established it again. Emma told him he looked good, older, but good, that she could see the boy she'd loved in the man he'd become. Thomas told her she was beautiful, more beautiful than his memory had managed to preserve. That time had only added depth to features that had already been perfect. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his careful, measured adult life. They talked with the desperate honesty of people who'd wasted too much time on propriety and protection, who'd learned the hard way that life was too short and too unpredictable to waste on anything less than complete truth. Emma told him about her marriage in detail he hadn't expected. Not the sanitized version she'd probably told friends and acquaintances, but the real truth underneath. She'd loved Richard, genuinely loved him, but it had been a different kind of love, built on respect and compatibility rather than the consuming passion she'd felt for Thomas. There had been good years and hard years, periods of contentment and periods of quiet loneliness that had nothing to do with Richard's presence or absence, but everything to do with the ghost of Thomas that she'd never quite exorcised from her heart. She told him about the guilt she'd carried, about feeling like she was cheating on Richard emotionally even though she'd never been unfaithful physically, about lying next to her husband at night and thinking about Thomas, about wondering what kind of person that made her. She told him about Richard's illness, about the complicated grief of losing someone you'd built a life with while simultaneously wondering if you'd built the right life, about feeling relief mixed with sadness when it was over, about the shame that came with that relief. Thomas listened without judgment, understanding in ways he couldn't have when they were young, that life was rarely simple, that love could exist in multiple forms simultaneously, that you could be faithful to one person while carrying another in your heart. He told her his own truth in return, about the loneliness of his life, about how he'd never allowed himself to fully commit to anyone else, because some part of him had always been waiting for her, hoping against hope that someday circumstances might change, that someday he might get another chance. He told her about his mother's death, about the complicated mixture of grief and relief he'd felt, about realizing too late that he'd sacrificed his happiness for someone who would have wanted him to be happy more than anything. He told her about watching his sister build a family, about being Uncle Thomas to her children, about the particular ache of witnessing other people's happiness while remaining perpetually on the outside looking in. As they talked, the afternoon light shifted. Autumn sun slanting through the trees at angles that painted everything gold. Other visitors passed by occasionally, couples walking hand in hand, families with children, elderly people moving slowly along the paths. But Thomas and Emma existed in a bubble of their own creation, aware of the world around them, but not part of it, focused entirely on each other and the work of rebuilding a bridge that had been demolished 33 years ago. Emma asked him why he'd never reached out, why if he'd been thinking about her all these years, he'd never made contact. The question wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious, and Thomas answered with the same raw honesty they'd been practicing all afternoon. He told her about the fear, about convincing himself she was better off without him, about the nobility narrative he'd constructed to make his sacrifice meaningful. He told her about seeing she'd married, had children, had built what looked from the outside like a perfect life, and how he'd used that as evidence that he'd made the right choice, that letting her go had been the loving thing to do. But then he told her the deeper truth beneath the surface justifications. He told her he'd been a coward, that he'd been too afraid of rejection to risk reaching out, that he'd convinced himself his love was more romantic and noble if he carried it silently rather than acting on it. He told her about the coffee shop moment, about how he'd almost crossed the room to her, about how the memory of her expression in that moment had haunted him for decades, the way she'd looked at him with such naked longing before turning away. Emma told him then something he hadn't known, something that made his heart physically ache. She told him that the man whose arm she'd touched in the coffee shop had been Richard, that it had been their third date, that seeing Thomas had made her realize she'd been using Richard as a shield against her feelings for Thomas, as a way to force herself to move on. She'd made a decision in that moment, she said, to commit to Richard, to stop looking backward and hoping for something that clearly wasn't going to happen. She'd turned away from Thomas intentionally, deliberately, as an act of self-preservation, but she also told him that decision had haunted her too, that she'd spent years wondering what would have happened if she'd crossed the coffee shop to Thomas instead of turning away, if she'd been brave enough to ask him if he still felt what she felt, if maybe they could try again. She told him about the parallel life she'd constructed in her mind, the one where she and Thomas had found their way back to each other, had built the life they'd planned when they were young and stupid and certain that love could conquer anything. As Emma talked about the life they might have lived, Thomas felt something shift inside him, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. They'd both been afraid, both been convinced the other had moved on, both been too scared of rejection to take the risk of reaching out. They'd wasted 33 years on mutual cowardice dressed up as nobility and respect, and moving on. The realization was devastating and oddly freeing in equal measure. The sun was starting to set, the garden taking on that particular quality of light that made everything seem suspended between day and night, real and magical. They'd been sitting on the bench for hours, talking with the kind of intensity that left them both emotionally exhausted and strangely energized. Emma shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, and Thomas automatically put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. She leaned into him without hesitation, her head finding the spot on his shoulder it had always fit perfectly, and Thomas felt a sense of rightness so profound it made his eyes sting with fresh tears. Emma turned her face up to his, their faces inches apart, and Thomas saw in her eyes the same question he was feeling, the same terrifying possibility. All afternoon they'd been circling around it, this enormous thing between them, this love that had somehow survived decades of neglect and separation. They'd established that it still existed, that both of them still felt it. But the question remained, what now? What did you do with a love this old and this persistent? How did you move forward when so much time had been lost? When you were different people than you'd been? When the life you might have built together existed only in imagination and regret? Thomas knew, sitting there with Emma in his arms as the October sun painted the garden in shades of amber and gold, that he had to say the words he'd been carrying for 33 years. Not over the phone, not implied through action, or assumed through context, but out loud, directly, giving them the weight and ceremony they deserved. He took a breath that felt like it encompassed all the years between then and now, all the longing and loss and hope he'd carried, and told Emma the truth he should have spoken decades ago. He told her he loved her, had always loved her, would probably always love her until his last breath left his body. He told her that if she would give him the chance, he wanted to spend whatever time they had left making up for the time they'd lost. He told her he didn't care that they were older now, that life had marked them both, that they were different people than they'd been. He told her that some loves were written in a language deeper than time, that what they'd had was rare and precious, and worth fighting for no matter how much time had passed. Emma's answer came not in words, but in action. She reached up and touched his face, her palm cupping his cheek with such tenderness it made his heart stutter. And then she pulled his face down to hers and kissed him. And Thomas felt 33 years of separation collapse into nothing, felt every day of loneliness and longing compress into this single point of contact, this joining of mouths and breath and hope. The kiss was different from the ones they'd shared when they were young, slower, deeper, carrying the weight of all the years between. But it held the same promise, the same sense of absolute rightness, the same feeling that this was what he'd been waiting for his entire life without knowing he was waiting. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Emma told him yes. Yes to another chance. Yes to seeing if what they'd had could be rebuilt. Yes to taking the risk of hoping again, of allowing themselves to imagine a future together. Yes to everything he'd been too afraid to ask for all these years. They sat together as darkness fell on the garden, holding each other and crying and laughing and talking about all the time they'd lost and all the time they might still have. And Thomas understood, finally, that love like theirs didn't have an expiration date. It simply waited, patient and persistent, for the right moment to prove it had never really died at all. The weeks following their reunion in the garden unfolded with a quality Thomas could only describe as surreal, as if he'd stepped sideways into an alternate timeline, one where happiness was permitted, where second chances were real, rather than just wishful thinking dressed up as possibility. He and Emma moved carefully at first, two people who'd been alone so long, they'd forgotten how to share space, share time, share the daily minutiae that constituted actual relationship, rather than idealized memory. They started with coffee dates, meeting at small cafes around Seattle, where they could talk for hours without anyone particularly noticing or caring. Thomas learned about Emma's life in the kind of granular detail that couldn't be covered in a single afternoon. Her daughter Claire's complicated relationship with her medical career, her son Michael's recent engagement, her youngest Sarah's passion for environmental activism. He learned about Richard's death in more depth, about the year of grueling treatment, about Emma's role as caregiver, about the particular exhaustion that came from watching someone you'd built a life with slowly disappear piece by piece. Emma learned about Thomas's career at Boeing in similar detail. The projects he'd worked on, the promotions he'd earned without particularly caring about them, the way he'd poured himself into work because it was easier than facing the emptiness of his personal life. She learned about his mother's final years, about his relationship with his sister's family, about the apartment he'd lived in for 15 years that had never quite felt like home. Because home, he was starting to realize, had always been wherever Emma was. As October bled into November, they progressed beyond coffee to actual dates, dinner at restaurants they'd once frequented as students, now updated and expensive in ways their younger selves would have found intimidating. They went to movies and held hands in the dark like teenagers, went to concerts at venues around the city, took long walks through neighborhoods they'd once known when rent was cheap and the future felt infinite. Each date was simultaneously familiar and new, echoes of who they'd been layered over who they'd become, creating something hybrid that belonged entirely to this moment rather than past or future. The physical aspect of their relationship developed slowly, both of them nervous about bodies that had changed, about the vulnerability of intimacy after so many years alone. Their first real kiss beyond that initial reunion had happened on Emma's doorstep after their 5th date, Thomas walking her home like he had when they were young, both of them laughing at the anachronism of it. Emma had invited him in, and Thomas had accepted, and they'd stood in her entryway kissing like teenagers while also being acutely aware they were not teenagers. The decades of life separated them from those young people who'd once loved each other with such reckless certainty. When they finally made love for the first time since they were 22, it was in Emma's bedroom on a rainy November afternoon, curtains drawn against the gray Seattle light, both of them nervous and eager in equal measure. Thomas had been terrified his body would fail him, that the reality of physical intimacy would somehow break the spell of reunion, that the fantasy they'd been constructing would shatter against the mundane truth of aging bodies and rusty skills. But it hadn't been like that at all. It had been tender and awkward and passionate and perfect. Two people remembering how to be together while also learning each other new. Emma's body had changed. Softer in some places, marked by the years of bearing children and living life. But she was still fundamentally Emma. Still the person whose touch made Thomas's entire nervous system light up like he'd been plugged into an electrical current. And she'd seemed to feel the same about him. Had traced the lines of his face and body with wondering fingers. Had told him he was beautiful in a way that made him believe it, despite all evidence to the contrary. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like Emma's laundry detergent and something uniquely her, Thomas had felt more at peace than he had in 33 years. This was right, he'd thought. This was what he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting, what his life had been moving toward through all the years of loneliness and routine. Emma had apparently been thinking similar thoughts, because she'd turned to him with tears in her eyes and told him she'd forgotten what it felt like to be completely happy, that she'd trained herself not to want things too much because wanting led to disappointment. But this, she'd said, gesturing to the two of them together, this was worth wanting, worth risking disappointment for. By December, they'd settled into something that resembled a real relationship rather than an extended reunion. Thomas found himself spending more nights at Emma's house than his own apartment, his toothbrush taking up residence in her bathroom, his clothes gradually migrating to her closet. They cooked dinner together, watched television with her commentary making him laugh at shows he'd found boring alone, fell asleep and woke up together in ways that felt both revolutionary and like something they'd been doing forever. But integration into each other's actual lives, rather than just the private bubble they'd been existing in, proved more complicated. Emma's children knew about Thomas by now, had been told their mother was seeing someone, but the full story, that this was her first love from college, that they'd been apart for over 3 decades, that she'd never quite stopped loving him even during her marriage to their father, that was harder to explain, harder for them to understand or accept. Claire, the oldest, had been cautiously supportive when Emma finally arranged for them to meet. She'd driven up from San Francisco for a weekend, had sat across from Thomas at Emma's dining table, and asked pointed questions about his intentions, about what he wanted from her mother, about whether he understood what it meant to date someone with grown children and grandchildren and a complicated life. Thomas had answered honestly, had told her he had no agenda beyond wanting to be with Emma, that he understood he was entering a family dynamic that had existed long before him, that he would never try to replace Richard or claim a role he hadn't earned. Michael, the middle child, had been more difficult. He'd been especially close to his father, had taken Richard's death hard, and the idea of his mother with someone else, particularly someone from before his father, someone who represented a life he'd never been part of, clearly troubled him. He'd been polite but distant when they met, had made it clear through body language, if not words, that he viewed Thomas with suspicion, as a potential threat to his mother's well-being and his father's memory. Sarah, the youngest, had surprised them both by being the most accepting. She'd told Emma privately that she was glad to see her mother happy, that she'd worried about her being alone, that life was too short not to grab happiness when it presented itself. Her acceptance had been a gift neither Thomas nor Emma had expected, a reminder that sometimes the people you think will struggle most with change are the ones who embrace it most readily. Thomas's own family had been simpler to navigate, mostly because there was less of it. His sister had been thrilled, had claimed credit for facilitating their reunion, and insisted on meeting Emma as soon as possible. When they'd finally made the trip to Portland for dinner, his sister had pulled Thomas aside and told him she'd never seen him look so happy, that whatever fears he might have about moving too fast or not being good enough, he should ignore them, because Emma clearly loved him, and he clearly loved her. And at their age, wasn't that enough? The question of what came next, of how to build a sustainable future rather than just enjoying an extended reunion, came to a head in early January. Thomas's lease was up in March, and the question of whether to renew it or not forced conversations they'd been avoiding. Emma had been widowed less than 2 years, Rushing into cohabitation or marriage might seem disrespectful, might upset her children, might jinx something that was working precisely because they were taking it slow. But at the same time, Thomas was 53 years old, and Emma was 52, and they'd already wasted 33 years. The idea of maintaining separate residences when all he wanted was to wake up next to her every morning, to come home to her every evening, to build the life they should have built decades ago. It felt like more wasted time, more unnecessary caution born from fear rather than wisdom. They'd had the conversation on a Sunday morning in January, snow falling outside Emma's windows in that rare Seattle way that made everything feel hushed and sacred. Emma had been making breakfast, Thomas reading the paper at her kitchen table, and the domesticity of it had struck him with sudden force. This was what he wanted every day for whatever time they had left. Not dates and sleepovers and careful navigation of separate lives, but actual life together, merged and messy and real. He'd told her this, setting down the paper and looking at her across the kitchen with the kind of vulnerable honesty that still sometimes felt foreign after so many years of protecting himself. He'd told her he wanted to move in with her, wanted to give up his apartment and bring the rest of his life into hers, wanted to stop pretending they were casual or taking it slow when what they actually were was two people desperately in love trying to make up for lost time. Emma had turned from the stove, her expression complex and hard to read, and for a moment, Thomas had thought he'd pushed too hard, asked for too much too soon. But then she'd crossed the kitchen and kissed him, her hands framing his face, and told him yes. Yes, she wanted that too. Yes, she was tired of caution and fear and worrying about what people would think. Yes, she wanted him in her space, in her bed, in her life fully, rather than peripherally. They'd made love right there on the kitchen floor, breakfast burning forgotten on the stove, both of them crying and laughing at the absurdity and perfection of it. Later, sitting on the floor eating toast that was slightly more charred than intended, Emma had told him something that made Thomas's heart swell almost painfully in his chest. She'd told him that being with him had reminded her what it meant to be alive rather than just going through motions, that she'd spent so many years being a good wife, a good mother, a good widow, that she'd forgotten how to just be Emma. With Thomas, she said, she remembered. She remembered the girl who'd run through gardens pulling him along, who'd laughed too loud and dreamed too big and loved too hard. That girl was still there, apparently, just waiting for the right person to call her back. Thomas moved in by the end of January, his modest possessions fitting into Emma's house with room to spare, as if space had been waiting for him all along. Her children handled it with varying degrees of acceptance. Sarah enthusiastic, Claire cautiously optimistic, Michael still distant but trying. Thomas understood that Michael needed time, that watching your mother be happy with someone who wasn't your father was complicated territory, even under the best circumstances. He gave Michael space while making it clear through actions that he wasn't going anywhere, that he intended to be a permanent fixture in Emma's life, and therefore, by extension, in theirs. By spring, they'd fallen into routines that felt both new and ancient. Thomas had taken early retirement from Boeing, finally freeing himself from the job he'd never really wanted, using his skills instead to do freelance architectural consulting for nonprofits and small firms. Emma had started painting again, something she'd given up years ago, setting up a studio in the spare bedroom where afternoon light poured through windows overlooking her garden. They cooked together, traveled together, spent hours talking about everything and nothing in the way of people making up for decades of missed conversations. But more than the activities or routines, what struck Thomas most profoundly was the simple fact of not being alone. After 33 years of coming home to empty apartments, of eating dinners in front of the television for company, of moving through life as a solitary figure, having someone to share the daily mundanities with felt miraculous. Emma leaving coffee cups on the counter, her clothes mixed with his in the laundry, her voice calling from another room, asking if he'd seen her reading glasses. These small domestic irritations that he'd heard other people complain about felt like gifts, proof that he was part of something larger than just himself. The question of marriage came up naturally rather than dramatically, on a Tuesday evening in May while they were working in the garden together, Emma directing while Thomas did the actual digging and planting. She'd made a comment about how well he took direction, how patient he was with her particular vision for how things should look, and he'd laughed and said that was what husbands were for. The word had hung there between them. Husband. And Emma had stopped pretending to supervise and looked at him with an expression that made his breath catch. She'd asked if that was what he wanted, if after everything, after finally getting what they'd wanted 33 years ago, he wanted to make it official, legal, permanent in ways that went beyond emotional commitment. Thomas had set down his trowel and taken Emma's dirt-smudged hands in his, heedless of the soil transferring between them, and told her yes. He wanted to marry her, had wanted to marry her since he was 22 years old, had carried that wanting through every year of separation and regret. He wanted her to be his wife, not because he needed legal documentation of what they meant to each other, but because he wanted the world to know, wanted to stand up in front of whatever family and friends would attend, and publicly claim her, publicly commit to her, publicly acknowledge that this person was his home and his heart, and his reason for everything. They were married in June in Emma's garden, the one they'd been planting together, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Thomas's sister and her family, a handful of close friends who'd watched them navigate reunion and integration with various levels of bemusement and support. Emma wore a simple blue dress that made her eyes brilliant, and Thomas wore a suit that fit better than any he'd owned in his life. And when the officiant asked if he took Emma to be his wife, Thomas's answer came out so forcefully, so emphatically, that several people in attendance laughed. But standing there, holding Emma's hands and saying the words he'd waited half a lifetime to say, to have, to hold, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for as long as they both lived, Thomas felt nothing but absolute certainty. This was right. This was what he'd been waiting for through all the years of loneliness and longing. This was the life he was supposed to have been living all along, the one he'd detoured away from for what he'd thought were all the right reasons. When the officiant pronounced them married and Thomas kissed Emma, her children watching, grandchildren giggling, the Seattle sun breaking through clouds to illuminate the garden like a benediction, he understood something fundamental. Love like theirs didn't follow normal timelines or logic. It simply existed, persistent and patient, wading through whatever obstacles life put in its path, surviving separation and loss and decades of neglect, ready to bloom again the moment it was given the chance. They honeymooned in Italy, a trip they'd planned as students but never taken, visiting the art and architecture they'd once studied from books. They walked through Florence holding hands like newlyweds half their age, ate gelato in Rome, stood in front of paintings in the Uffizi and museums throughout Tuscany, Emma explaining artistic techniques while Thomas pointed out architectural details, both of them finally getting to share their passions with the one person who'd always understood why these things mattered. But the real honeymoon, Thomas thought, wasn't Italy. It was every ordinary day back home, every morning waking up next to Emma, every evening cooking dinner together, every night falling asleep with her in his arms. It was the life they were building, finally, after waiting so long to build it. It was the simple, extraordinary fact of not being alone anymore, of having found his way back to the one person who'd always felt like home. On their first anniversary, sitting in the same spot in the garden where they'd been married, Emma told Thomas something that made him weep without shame. She told him that everyone had always talked about her marriage to Richard, like it was the great love story. High school sweethearts reunited, happy ending, beautiful family. But she'd known the truth underneath, that she'd been settling for comfortable when what she'd really wanted was consuming, that she'd built a good life, but not the right life. This, she said, gesturing to the two of them, their clasped hands, the garden they'd created together, the life they were living. This was her actual love story. The one that had started when she was 18, and had taken 40 years and countless detours to reach its proper ending. The one that had survived separation and loss and the weight of decades. The one that proved, finally and definitively, that some loves were strong enough to wait half a lifetime and still burn bright when given the chance. Thomas told her he'd waited half a lifetime to hear those words, to know that what he'd felt all those years wasn't just obsessive nostalgia or an inability to move on, but actual, real, legitimate love that she'd been feeling too. He told her every day of those 33 years had been worth it if they'd led him here, to this moment, to this life with her. He told her he'd wait another half a lifetime if he had to, but thank God he didn't have to. Thank God they'd found their way back. Thank God for second chances and patient love, and the courage to finally say the words they'd both been carrying for so long. As the sun set on their anniversary, painting the Seattle sky in shades of pink and orange, Thomas held his wife, finally, officially, permanently, and understood that love like theirs didn't fit into normal narratives or timelines. It simply existed, persistent and powerful, surviving whatever life threw at it, waiting patiently for the moment when both people were finally brave enough to reach for it again. He'd waited half a lifetime to say, "I still love you." And it had been worth every second of that wait to hear Emma say the same words back, to build the life they should have built decades ago, to finally get their happy ending. Delayed but not denied, earned through patience and pain and the stubborn refusal to let go of something real, even when every logical reason said they should. In the garden they'd built together, in the life they'd finally claimed, surrounded by the evidence that some loves are worth waiting for no matter how long it takes. Thomas and Emma held each other as darkness fell, already planning the tomorrow that would be theirs, and the day after that, and all the days that followed. Not wasted anymore, not waiting anymore, just living, fully and finally, the life love had always promised them, but that they'd needed 33 years to learn how to claim. Did Thomas and Emma's story resonate with your heart? This profound journey reminds us that true love doesn't fade with time. It simply waits, patient and enduring, for the moment when both hearts are finally ready to try again. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is allowing yourself to hope after years of resignation, to reach across decades of silence and say the words you've been carrying all along. If this story stirred something in you, a memory of your own, a hope you thought you'd lost, or simply the belief that it's never too late for happiness, I'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. I cherish knowing that listeners from all corners of the world gather here to share these moments together. Where are you joining us from today? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if stories like this touch your soul, please subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more heartfelt journeys waiting to be told. Your story could be the next one shared here. Your presence and support make it possible for me to continue bringing these stories to you. Thank you for allowing me into your day.